Now, those of you who are fans of mine will know that what I'm responding to today, I have already responded to in the past in a video that I have taken down. And that's because since that video, I've received some pretty well-deserved criticism. My biggest mistake, apart from not really being educated in what I was talking about, was that I believed that this book, Cold Case Christianity, was trying to prove the validity of the written accounts of the Gospels, the books themselves, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, when in actuality it's trying to give evidence of what's actually in the books, also confusingly referred to as the Gospel. The key difference being that if you're trying to prove what's in the Gospels, then you very well can use the books of the Gospels, evaluate it, and see whether or not it's likely for those events to have occurred. But now that I've went back through it, done a little bit more research, I'm still not convinced that Jesus actually rose from the dead, but instead I think it's more likely that Jesus' body was stolen and his disciples, or at least anyone claiming to be an eyewitness, actively lied about it. So let's dive back into Cold Case Christianity, where Wallace is talking about Habermas and Licona's minimal facts. Now, I'm willing to grant all of these to some extent, except the third one, that Jesus' disciples believed they saw Jesus resurrected. Now, I don't have a whole lot of scholarly sources readily accessible to me, but we can look at Habermas and Licona's book, which Warner more or less got this from, The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus. And in it, this is how they said that the disciples for sure believed what they were saying. They say, one need only read through the book of Acts to find reports that the disciples were willing to suffer for their belief that the risen Jesus had appeared to them. Okay, sure, the book of Acts does report persecution of Christians, but the thing is, scholars pretty much agree that it isn't an accurate representation of early Christian persecution. There's a lot of anti-Jew sentiment and pro-Roman sentiment, which makes this probably a sort of propaganda to appeal to the Gentiles. So the book of Acts should not be taken by its word in this regard. Now he goes on to list a bunch of accounts talking about early Christian persecution, mostly from early church fathers. And yes, early Christians were persecuted in isolated events that typically didn't really affect them much. That is, until some of them were killed, notably including Peter and Paul, who died sometime after the Great Fire in Rome and sometime before the end of Nero, after Nero blamed the fire on Christians and kind of went crazy for a while. And there's no real indication that they were willing to die in this way. Nero just wanted to kill them, so he did, and there's no indication that they were even given the chance to recant. And even if they were given the chance, them doing so would cause a huge effect within the early church, and they knew that, so that would give them an incentive to keep to their story. And when they were coming up with this story of Jesus' appearances, they couldn't have expected that some of them were to be killed because of it. No one questions the sincerity of a Muslim terrorist who blows himself up in a public place or the Buddhist monk who burns himself alive as a political protest. Extreme acts do not validate the truth of their beliefs, but willingness to die indicates that they regard their beliefs as true. Okay, sure, but there's no indication that they were actually willing to die. The only such apostles that were martyred were Peter, Paul, and I think James. Yes, they happened, but these were attacks on Christians based on hatred of Christians. That doesn't indicate that they expected that when they came up with the appearance stories, and it doesn't indicate that they were given a chance to recant. The martyrdoms they list here are mostly cited in Acts, which, as I've explained before, isn't totally reliable. Anyone who didn't personally claim to have seen the risen Jesus may have been deceived by those who did. So the early church fathers, yeah, they may very well have been willing to die for their beliefs. Hell, even the apostles that lied may have still believed in the teachings of Jesus, even if they had to lie about the resurrection, because perhaps they valued other people's ability to believe in Jesus than their own lives, even if it meant something as extreme as this. So the idea that they all for sure believed what they were saying doesn't actually seem that certain to me, but there are still criticisms of this idea. Back to cold case Christianity, Wallace states that this hypothesis fails to explain the transformed lives of the apostles. To take a closer look at what he's talking about, let's go back to the case for the resurrection of Jesus. Here it first specifies the apostle Paul and talks about how he changed. But I find it kind of odd. The only accounts we have of Paul's conversions are from Paul himself, which obviously could be dishonest, and also in Acts, which could have learned it from a church which Paul told. Now, Paul was the only one around during his conversion, and he claims that Jesus appeared to him in a vision, not physically, making his account unverifiable at the time, and a lot easier of a lie to maintain. What's even more suspicious is that he went on to meet Peter and James, who could have actually converted him and then convinced him to conspire with them. Since Paul became a prominent member and founder of churches, his new high position could very well have given him incentive to go along with the lie and perhaps transform his character. Then it talks about how James changed, since he was said to have disbelieved and then to have been a leader of the church. But I think it's too difficult to make a conclusion based on James. See, the accounts that mention James, they vary, and the accounts that says that he disbelieved don't go on to say that Jesus appeared to him, nor that he converted. Nevertheless, James, the brother of Jesus, could very well have been in on the lie, and being related to Jesus and becoming the leader of the church had an incentive to do so. After all, the non-canonical Gospel of Thomas states that Jesus, after he resurrected, gave James authority over the apostles, which very well could have been fabricated in his favor. But that's another thing. As Wallace says, let me simply say that I am hesitant to embrace any theory that requires the conspirational effort of a large number of people over a significant period of time when there is personally little or nothing to gain by their effort. This theory requires us to believe that the apostles were transformed and emboldened not by the miraculous appearance of the resurrected Jesus, but by elaborate lies created without any benefit to those who were perpetuating the hoax. But I think that they had plenty of incentive. For one, Jesus' resurrection may have been expected if he claimed that it would happen, and his body may have been stolen to satisfy that expectation and to strengthen the Christian faith, and not only continue the large following that Jesus had, but also become leaders of it themselves, which could be plenty of incentive, whether or not they actually believed in Jesus' teachings, which they very well could have. Even then, Jesus, claiming to be the Messiah sent by God that the Jews were waiting for, dying a terrible, shameful death reserved only for the lowest of people, would have been crushing to the Christian community. Surely the apostles didn't want that. It could also potentially have to do with money. In Acts 4, it says that there were plenty of people willing to sell their possessions and lay the money at the apostles' feet. This isn't quite as likely, but it is a possibility. But Wallace says that he'll examine the problem with conspiracy theories in Chapter 7, so let's jump to that. Here he lists some characteristics that he says successful conspiracies have. He elaborates on them afterwards, but suffice it to say he doesn't think the apostles lying about the resurrection are like this. He says that there should be a small number of conspirators, but there may not actually have been many. It would have been limited to the apostles and perhaps maybe a few other people, but not the 500 mentioned in 1 Corinthians. For those of you who don't know, 1 Corinthians 15 contains a creed, which lists a bunch of people that the resurrected Jesus appeared to. Now, scholars do date this particular creed to have been taught to Paul some few years after Jesus' death, except that they think that this 500 and James mentioned could have been an addition from Paul, not in the original creed. And yes, admittedly, this is still a decent number of people to start and maintain a conspiracy. But what makes you think that their accounts actually stayed consistent? All of the accounts that we have of the appearances, they vary, and they spread out to different areas, so it wouldn't be immediately obvious to their followers if their stories weren't consistent. And that leads me to the next point: thorough and immediate communication. He says that an investigator could easily pit one conspirator against another. But who did that? Who traveled to different areas to all of the apostles to see if their stories added up? If their stories weren't consistent, people wouldn't have noticed. And it's not like this would have been a very difficult lie to keep up. All that they had to agree on was that Jesus resurrected, appeared to them, and then ascended into heaven, covered up by a cloud from any other observer. As far as the short time span, yeah, they kept up this lie for a pretty long time. But again, it wasn't a difficult lie to keep up, and people didn't have access to each apostle's retelling of the story. Not to mention that Christians wouldn't really have felt the need to investigate this so much. They would be incredibly willing to accept that Jesus rose from the dead, and willing to accept their testimony as proof of that. Of course, the Jews weren't as convinced, and some of them thought the same thing that I do. But nevertheless, there would have been such a willingness among the Christian community that there wouldn't really be any pressure for them to confess, which is the last point that he makes. But what about the significant relational connections? Now, the apostles, even though not all of them were related, would have been following Jesus and his teachings for years. Wallace goes on to downplay this, but I think that it's more significant than he's trying to make it seem, especially if they did still believe in Jesus' teachings after his death. He also points out that they were martyred, which in most cases is little more than legend, and that doesn't indicate that they were willing to die, or that they recanted, or that they were even given the chance to recant. If people wanted to kill them later, that doesn't mean that they were right, nor that they considered that a possibility when they were coming up with it. Going back to chapter 2, where we were, Wallace says that Jewish authorities took precautions to guard and seal the tomb, but he cites Matthew, which is the only gospel to mention it, and scholars consider this to be a later addition, invented to respond to Jewish critics who are claiming what I'm claiming now, that the body was stolen. The guards and the seal probably weren't actually there. He also points out that there were 500 eyewitnesses according to Paul, which, as I explained before, isn't the case. He also states that the apostles lacked a motivation to lie, but in the chapter that he refers to, he doesn't consider the possibility that they would have done it to save Christianity as a whole. And he doesn't consider the power they would have gained as a likely motivation because it wasn't as grand as modern-day popes, and also states that they were attacked in the reign of Nero. But I maintain that they did have influence over their Christian in-group, which made it worthwhile, and that their persecutions, while sometimes intense, were few and far between. The Christian church did not, by any means, struggle to stay alive. His last point on this matter is that the disciples were transformed, which I talked about earlier. But, believe it or not, even if these appearances were fabricated, the lives of the disciples could have changed drastically when they went from being followers of a new messianic movement to then being leaders of a large, growing religious movement. So here's what I think happened. I think that once Jesus died, the disciples either didn't expect him to resurrect, or that Jesus didn't come back from the dead when they expected him to. So, Jesus' grave was robbed. Maybe it was by the conspirators, maybe not, but either way, the tomb was empty. And those who claimed to be eyewitnesses to the appearances agreed on a story, relatively simple, that Jesus appeared to them, then ascended into heaven. They preached that, which strengthened the faith of Christians who were willing to believe it. Newly in charge of the church, they spread out to different areas, and gained new followers there. And perhaps their stories, or at least their oral traditions, started to diverge, especially with Paul. Then, being a new and despised religion, they received persecution from time to time, but still very easily kept the church intact. Then, somewhere along the line, the Gospels were written by anonymous authors according to oral tradition, and the Gospels, being in the category of ancient Greco-Roman biographies known as bioi, weren't short of embellishments. Now, don't misunderstand the point of this video. My point is not to say that this is 100% for sure what happened and how it happened, and if after hearing this you don't think that it is a very possible explanation, then I understand. I'm not 100% convinced of it myself. But my point is that this is an explanation that is more likely than the idea that Jesus is a god who died and rose again. Especially since we have seen religion started by schemes and lies, and we haven't seen any other indication of a god or of anything supernatural, which maybe you don't agree with that, but that's a totally different topic.